Well, thank you. It's good to be here with all of you as well. Thank you for coming and kicking off the missions conference this week. And it's great to see you. And some of you don't have your masks on, so it's good to see who you are because so often we don't get to see each other. So it's good to be with you. I appreciate the fact that there's been a lot of work that has been going on by the missions conference committee, and they've done a lot of great work. And I know having the kids here was a challenge, and yet I know that it's going to be good. And having you guys here starting today, I'm grateful for the time that you've come to be with us as well. It's been a while that Mary and I have been a part of a missions conference just because of our new role, and so we're excited about these days with you here at MAC, and as being a part of our church this year. We're excited about being able to share some of our story with you during this time. As Pastor mentioned on Sunday, that the theme for Missions Conference is unfinished. And you will see that slide on the board up there, unfinished. But what I'd like to do tonight is really tell some stories. And actually, in a lot of cultures, storytelling is the most effective way of communicating. And even in cultures that are not oral cultures, that is also very, very effective. But I felt like tonight would be good just to tell some stories and to see how God has been weaving His sovereignty, His will, His purposes through all of that over all of the years. These three stories there's two stories that are unfinished and one story that's finished, as we weave those together to see what God is doing. And I hope as you listen, that you'll hear the sovereignty of God through it. I hope that you will also see how that God is wanting to accomplish His purposes by discipling different people throughout all of those stories. And in the end, I hope that it will be an encouragement to you to know that God is working in your lives as well, in wanting to finish some stories through your life and in the lives of others that you will come in contact with. But first of all, I'd like to start with a map, and I know a lot of missionaries do that, but since most of the story is going to be centered in Cambodia, I wanted to just sort of tune you into where that is. Some of you may know, and some of you may not be aware of it. Where in the world is it? And so you can see it's there in Southeast Asia, tucked between Thailand and Vietnam on each side, and then Laos there to the north. And so we're going to go into that little country of Cambodia. It's about the size of the state of Missouri, and it has about 16 million people that live there. So here's the map of Cambodia itself, and you will see the capital city has a star by it, Phnom Penh, and that is a PH, a hard P sound, so if you're wondering how to pronounce that, Phnom Penh. And then that's where Mary and I spent all of our 20 years there in Cambodia, living there, though our outreach and our ministry went from there into the provinces. But I also want you to notice the city of Poi Phet, which is over there to the northwest. It'll be over here on your left, because one of the stories is related to that town, and I want you just to have sort of an awareness of where that is in the country. So that's Cambodia, and that's where I want to take you, begin to think about how God is working in the land of Cambodia. The first story began about 70 years ago. And my father, Cliff Westergren, who is up there on the right, And he was a teenager in high school in Chicago. He was raised by his father because his mother had passed away at the age of 8. He, during high school, he was placed in a class. In those days they had vocational classes. He was placed in a class, a print class. And he did not like it at all. Didn't want to be there. In fact, he went to his father and said, "I'd like to get out of this class. Can you help me get out of this class?" And the father spoke with him and said, "Son, sometimes the best way out is the way through." And so he really encouraged him to stay in the class. So he stayed in the class, ended up doing well, got an A at the end. Eventually he was able to get a job, a print shop there after schools and then in the summers, and so he really grew in his ability as a printer. Then in college, when he went to college, he went to Nyack College. He worked himself through college as a printer. 2 years into his sophomore year, a veteran missionary from Cambodia came to Nyack College looking for a printer because he had just completed translating the Cambodian Bible. The very first one, the only one. He had just finished translating it and says, "I need somebody to help me print the Bible." My father was the only one in the student body that was a printer. And so that summer, with 12 other college girls, they printed the Cambodian Bible on the Nyack College campus. Now think about this. First of all, the missionary was the only one who knew Cambodian, the only one who knew the script. And so he was expecting these college students to help him print this Bible. And in those days, they did print set. So you take all the letters. Fortunately, the Cambodian language is alphabetic, so that you take each part of the words and you set it into a block one by one. And these were students that didn't know the language at all. It's like, is this upside down, sideways? Which way does this go? And so the first week, it took them, they only did 7 pages. Really slow. But as they kept going, eventually they were able to get like 80 pages a week done. And so they finished printing the Cambodian Bible there on the campus of Nyack College through the direction and the help of my father, who went to class, that he didn't want to be in class to become a printer. Before my father graduated and before my mother graduated, they met in school at Nyack College. My mom was from southern Texas. My dad was from Chicago, and they met in New York. And God had called them together, and they were going to go to Cambodia. But the Christian Missionary Alliance leadership said, we'd like to send you in a few months. Could you get married so we can send you? So after they were married quickly in 4 months, and they got on a ship and traveled by boat for 6 weeks on a boat. My mother was green the whole time. Did not enjoy it whatsoever. They arrived there. Now, I don't know if you've seen the picture. You saw the picture of the Bible there. Notice the script. That was the task that was ahead, to try to learn the language and then to be able to print it. And it's a language where you have to have a wraparound in computers so that it wraps around so it keeps going. Otherwise it won't connect because there's no break between words. All the words are connected. So you have to learn how to read it as it's by having them connected. And so that was the challenge that was ahead of my parents when they arrived in Cambodia in 1956. My dad was asked to replace Mr. Hammond, who was the one who translated the Bible, and to run the printing press there in Cambodia. So I grew up in Cambodia, and the one picture you saw was me in the back in the middle there. That was me at about 8, 9 years old. And sorry, I had to cut off my siblings because the picture wouldn't fit. But I had 2 brothers and a sister that were also there with living overseas. That was an amazing gift to be able to live and grow up in Cambodia. I grew up around the printing shop every day, all the time, around books, and so my love and my appreciation for books and literature grew enormously. I also saw the importance of it, and the influence was going to have greater impact on me than I realized as we go down the road and continue to talk about a story. Now, in 1975, as many of you know, Cambodia became closed because of the Khmer Rouge. The communists that came in and took over the country and ravaged that country and destroyed it, with over 3 million Cambodians that were killed during the next 4-year period. And so all of our international workers who were there had to leave. It was a sad time for them, because those 50 years that missionaries had been in that country, they could only really name about 700 believers. The hearts of the Cambodians were hard. They were not open to the gospel, no matter what the missionaries did during those years. And so they were sad. They felt like the job isn't finished yet. Why are we having to leave? Why is God allowing the door to be closed? But they had to leave. But fortunately, the missionaries were astute enough to take hold of each of the 92 titles that had been printed at that time and brought one of each copy out of the country, so that they had that with them and to begin to build on that and to print others. And in those days, that wasn't an easy feat, because we didn't have computers then. And so to try to hold on to them and to then reproduce them was a great challenge. Ten years later, Mary and I were assigned and asked to go to Cambodia. And so because of your experience, Steve, having that kind of relationship there, we would like you and Mary to go back in and reopen the field. It was in 1986 that we were assigned that, but it took 3 to 4 years longer before the door actually opened for us to go into Cambodia. So we went to Bangkok, learned the language, the Thai language there, and then moved to the border and started learning Cambodian. And while we're there on the border, in partnership with OMF, Overseas Missionary Fellowship, I don't know how many of you have heard of that organization, I was asked with them to take over the literature ministry that they have been doing together and be responsible for distribution of literature into the refugee camps. The refugee camps, there were probably 10 or 12 of them, and in those refugee camps, they estimate there were 350,000 refugees throughout those camps. And yet from 1975 to 1993, as there were a Christian influence into these camps, and through literature and through the ministry of Christian organizations, we estimate that 120,000 of those 350,000 refugees had come to the Lord. See that connection again of the influence of literature, because that was the Cambodian Bible was very much a part of what was taught there in the refugee camps, as well as the only songbook ever produced in Cambodia was also the one that was used in the refugee camps. The ministry was not finished, and God knew that. And he had brought Cambodians out of the country who, when they were in the country, their hearts were hard. But in the refugee camps, God had softened their hearts. Because there's a Cambodian proverb that says, when the blood flows, the heart grows softer. And God knew that this was the way that he was able to bring the Cambodians to himself. And so God was connecting those strands. He was getting one strand and then a second strand and bringing that together and creating a cord that would be strong to be able to finish the task. When Mary and I were able to go in 1990, there were only about 150 foreigners in the country at that time. And we were spied on throughout the time that we were there. For the first almost 2 years, they had a spy designated to watch us. So everything we did, day in and day out, even when we went to language school in these three-wheel pedicabs, whether we walked to the market, wherever we went, we had somebody who was following us as a spy. And yet throughout that time, God enabled us to slowly have contact with the Christians. And at that time, we estimate that there was only about 200 Christians that had survived or who had not left the country. So it was a very small number of believers that were in the country at the time. You know, we were able to have informal conversations with them. We had to do it overtly. I mean, we had to do it in a way that they would not, the government would not see us, because it actually would be more damaging for them to be seen with us than for us to be seen with them. Within 10 years, I forgot a very important part of the story. We came into the country and realized we don't have Cambodian literature. It's in Thailand. How are we going to get that into Thailand? Fortunately, at that time, the border of Cambodia was very porous, meaning that you could just bring about just about anything you wanted, however you wanted, into the country. And so we took advantage of that and managed to truck literature, whether it was a gas truck, a bus, or just a regular commercial truck, to truck them across the border from Poipet to Phnom Penh, which at that time was about 18 hours to get there, even though it was only about 300 miles, because the roads were so bad you could not travel very quickly. But we got 20 tons of literature across the border down to Phnom Penh. God made that possible because he knew the job was not finished. Can you imagine putting literature into a gas truck? But it was God's way of protecting the literature, because when it went through the umpteen number of checkpoints by the police from Poipet to Phnom Penh, they didn't think anything of it, and they let it go right through. God in his sovereignty was organizing and making it possible for the work that he wanted to finish to take place. This was important to have this literature here because from 1990 to 1999, we estimate that the church grew from 200 believers to 200 and 250,000 believers. Now think about that. In 1975, when the IW's, the international workers, left Cambodia, things were really hard. They had worked very hard, doing all that they could, and they could only estimate about 700 believers. So in the refugee camps, there was 120,000. And in Cambodia, the church was coming alive, and there was 200 to 250,000 in just a 9-year period. But they needed scriptures. They needed literature. They needed lots of things. But God made it possible for us to bring across the border, already printed, because at that time, initially, the government was not open to printing. We were able to have it ready and distributed for our refugees and those who came across the border to receive this literature in God's Word. But at that time, around 1999-2000, while the church was exploding, and we were fortunate that the Christian Missionary Alliance, which actually was the only source of literature at that time, because all the other organizations had not been involved in literature or printing, did not have the know-how or the skills of the people that knew the language, we were really the only source of that literature and that way of ministry. That God put in my heart a new and different vision. Because I was realizing that in order for us to really begin to impact the church as it continued to grow, was actually to have a publishing house that would enable us to impact the whole church, not just CMA churches. For you see, at that particular time, even in the early days of Cambodia, there were groups who did not want to work with the Christian Missionary Alliance. And so they were not interested in our literature, even though they had none. And that is not the way it should be. So God gave a vision that we would open a publishing house that would be for the whole church and not just for the CMA church. But how was God going to do that? I began making contacts because I had been there a while. I mean, contacting all the organizations and said, this is the vision God's given to me, and I want to do this. Do you want to join and be a part of this? Out of the 29 organizations who came to the meeting, only 4 of them came on board. We said, that's enough. Let's do this. And so I began with 2 Cambodians. One who had had some experience in editorial work and one who had none. And so in this effort of doing this publishing house, had to train everyone to do everything, to run a business even. And I'm going, I can't do this. I'm not trained in doing this. How am I going to do this? And so my prayer, Lord, was, you asked me to do this, but how do I do this? You need to bring the people to me to do this. And as I was making contact and studying and learning and going to conferences to learn about printing and learning about publishing houses and all of that, I ran into a gentleman who had done the same thing. He had started from scratch in Brazil. And had already had done ministry for 40 years and doing a publishing house there, and said, I'll come and help you. And he gave 2 weeks of his time, and I spent 10 hours a day for 2 weeks, and he poured everything he had into me to get this started. And then along the way, there were a number of other people who came alongside and said, we want to help you. God knew the task was unfinished, but he had all the resources. He knew who those people were. He was ready to help. We just needed to ask and call out to him to give us what it was that we needed. So even though we only had 2 staff, things began to take off. We got 1 title done. Whoa, we celebrated. We got 2 titles done. We finally got 5 done in that first year. We go, whoa, man, we are really making progress. Because actually along the way, and here's some of the titles, by the way, that are here if you're interested in looking at them. But one of the first things that I really wanted to do was to develop like a concordance dictionary, Bible dictionary that would be helpful for the church, because even in the years that my father was doing printing and literature, there wasn't one. And so I said, that's the first thing we need to start to do. And as God gave direction to somebody that says, yes, I will allow you to print a book, to translate and to print a book, and I will not ask for any royalties. I will not ask for any additional cost for that. You're allowed to do this. And then when we started to do that, I was praying, Lord, how are we going to pay for this printing? It's going to be way too expensive, and we need to do 8 volumes. How in the world are we going to do that in the Cambodian language? Only to shorten the story to say that the very first time as we were praying, a church that we never knew, did not know at all in Canada, and says, we've been praying about ways that we want to be able to help in literature, and we heard that you are starting a publishing house, and we want to help you, and we have $10,000 that we want to give to you, and that was the cost of the first volume. And there's more to go, more stories to go with all the rest of the volumes. And within 2 years, we had finished all 8 volumes, fully paid for and affordable for Cambodians to purchase. How much do you think one volume like this would cost? Let me help you a little bit to think about it. The expendable income for Cambodians at the time that we started the publishing house in 2004 was $2.50 a month. Expendable income. So, got a battle to fight. How do you sell a book to people who don't have any money when they're just barely making it? And it's trying to run a business that will support itself. Well, this first volume we sold for $1.90. And only printed 2,000 copies. But believe it or not, in 2 years, we sold out. Because it was something the church not only needed, but wanted. God had gone before and said this was something that needed to be finished, and I'm going to help you finish it. In the first 4 years, we finished 57 titles and produced 110,000 books. And we were able to support 6 staff without any donations. How is that is that possible? Humanly, not. But the Lord made that happen. The job was not finished yet. Well, the second chord of the story is by the name of a young man named Makara. Makara was a teenager, older teenager, when he came into the church that Mary and I were planting in Phnom Penh. He grew up in a Christian home, but his faith was very young. You could tell that he was not sure of all that he believed or how he was going to, what he was going to believe as an individual. I had the privilege of discipling him for a year through our church plant. Because we considered him a new believer, and as we were starting this new plant, we developed a whole discipleship program, a ministry there for new believers, and he was a part of that. And one of the events that we had for discipling was a retreat. And so one evening during the retreat, there was a time off in the evening. They could do what they wanted to do, and there was a pool there. But we, as a family, had gone back to our cottage because we had young kids then and need to get them to bed. But soon after we had gone to the cottage, we heard some shouting. And the shouting basically in Cambodian said, "Makara has drowned, Makara has drowned." So I ran out as quickly as I could to find out what was happening. Yes, he had actually stopped breathing. He had drowned in that water. Pulled him out quickly. Unfortunately, one of the other missionaries of the couple that we worked with in this church plant knew CPR and was able to, after several tries, was able to resuscitate him. But his breathing was very, very faint. So we knew we had to get him to a clinic, but in those days in Cambodia, there was not much that you could rely upon medically. So we went to one of the foreign clinics there. Unfortunately, they were open at 10 o'clock at night. He was able to get some care, but he was very in critical condition. His parents came and stayed with him for the night. Not sure if he was going to make it through the night. Fortunately, when I came that next morning, he was awake and was able to talk, but still quite tired, and I'm still a bit foggy. After we left the clinic, he went home and rested for the next week, and during one of those days, Mary and I went to visit him, and Makara testified this to us. He said, "Lok Steve," Lok is for Mr., Lokru means teacher, Lokru Steve, "I want you to know that I know that I'm sitting here talking to you because Jesus has saved me twice. He has saved me from the death of sin, and he has saved me from physical death. And because I know he loves me that much, I want to follow him all the rest of my life. And to show that, I want to change my name from Makara to Timothy." So his name today is Timothy. Timothy obviously gained strength and continued to do well. Decided to go and get his bachelor's degree in computer science programming, got his master's in English, and was doing well, went into the workplace, got a job and a secular job, but after a while he says, I'm tired of that. They don't treat you very well. I don't like that job. Can I come and work for you? At that time, I was running the Alliance Literature Ministry, which is not the publishing house. That was sort of just CMA work. And so at that time, I was looking for someone, so he came and worked for us as a designer, as an artist, and helping us with our programming. But during that time, that was when the vision came for me to start this publishing house. And after 4 years of working through this publishing house, God gave to me another idea, and this is actually something I knew about from the very beginning. After 4 years, God said, it's now time for you to start thinking about finding somebody who can replace you as the director of the publishing house. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that and why we do that, or was thinking about doing that. And so I began looking at, okay, I have to start finding applicants and have to go through that process and consider who those people might be. And Timothy was one of those 4 applicants. Went through an arduous process with the board, not just by myself, but also with the board that had been developed at the publishing house. And through that, decided that Timothy was actually the best candidate. And so we hired him. And for 2 years, I poured my life into him, mentoring him, discipling him, spending day in and day out with him, really wanting to pass on values and ethos and ways to treat staff and ways to think about excellence of ministry, the ways to be a disciple of Christ in business. Because in 2010, Mary, 2 years after starting that process, Mary and I went on home assignment. And it seemed like the perfect time. Only 6 years into starting this publishing house, and 8 staff later, I turned this over to Timothy as the director of the publishing house. Now we knew that things weren't quite finished yet, but we needed to learn how to relinquish this role to Timothy to take over. Timothy, over the last 10 years, has grown as a director, as a leader, so much so that he has been recognized by the Lausanne Covenant, I don't know if you know Lausanne Group, as one of the emerging leaders in Asia. And then God directed him also to meet up with Dr. Riken, who was the president of Wheaton College. And now as a friend has been invited to be a part of different things with him as a leader, and is supported by Dr. Riken as well. God knew there was a lot of unfinished work to be done. But he was taking care of it as we followed him. The third cord of the braid is actually me. Part of that cord, the 3 cords. It's about me in terms of stepping aside, stepping away from my role. Even when it seemed like the work was not finished for me, it was finished. The Lord said, it's finished. I can take it from here. You need to let go. There's a lot of things that God has been doing since I've let go. Even greater and and bigger than the things that I've just given you a few stories about. Almost every book, those first 50 to 60 titles, has a story connected of God's provision. See, in the Christian Missionary Alliance, as missionaries, we actually know that one of our jobs is to work ourselves out of a job. And that we have to have that mindset from the beginning when we start a ministry. And for me, that was initially, there was a time when to relinquish something was extremely difficult, because as a man, my identity was wrapped up in my role. I had started it. I had poured my life into it. This is what I do, and I want to do it well, and so that's who I am. I had a hard experience with this. And then that's when God said, Steve, that's part of the unfinished work that I had to have you do. And because of that, God then prepared me well for this role. And I knew, hey, publishing house is his. Yeah, there's still a lot to be done, and I knew it, and I knew what needed to be done. But he was saying, I've got this. I'm the owner of the publishing house, so all right, we're done. You're done, Steve. Time to move on. But this is the work of missionaries within the Christian Missionary Alliance. That our role is to help equip, disciple, and enable them, our national counterparts, to take over for us to move aside. Because our job is finished. But he's preparing us for what's next that he wants us to do. Because that work is not finished. I wanted you to be able to hear this, because it's actually a part of a story you don't often hear from a missionary. But that's what we do in terms of the story, the title of Finished or Unfinished. You know, after I had left and gone on home assignment and relinquished this role to Timothy, I was sad. It was hard to be sure. And there were still things that needed to be done. But I said, Lord, it's all yours. I spent the next 3 years actually grieving about leaving Cambodia and about leaving the publishing house, because I felt that was one of the best fits of ministry I have had in 25 years. But the Lord said, okay, you've let go. I'm going to give you something. And over the next 3 years, he gave me the opportunity to return to Cambodia for 6 times to work with Timothy as a consultant. And Timothy wanted that to happen so much, he actually wanted us to come back and live there, and so that we could help him. And I go, no, that's not going to work well. But going back just on an occasional basis to be able to help him to shore up those 3 or 4 areas that needed help. And now they're in an amazing place to be able to do those things well. What a gift that was. God's gracious provision for the work that is yet undone, unfinished. I would ask that you would include a conclusion here. I'd like to ask you that you would pray for Timothy and the unfinished work that they're doing. It's enormous. They are the largest Christian publishing house in Cambodia, which I give thanks to the Lord for. It's what we had a goal of, that it would be the first of mind, that they would think about where they would go for good literature. But their goal is to get literature, have it available to the churches throughout all of Cambodia, 22 provinces. And right now they've managed to get it into 8 provinces. And it's hard to go into a province in Cambodia because so much of the infrastructure, as you get deeper into the provinces, just do not work. Muddy roads. There's not communication, even cell phones not working well. There's a lot of things that are not working well in the provinces, so it's difficult to get literature into the provinces. But their desire is that all the churches, all the church leaders have access to the literature, to the study books, to Bible dictionaries, everything they need that they can carry on the work that God has called them to do. That's the unfinished work for Fount of Wisdom, which is incidentally, I don't think I ever used the name of the publishing house called Fount of Wisdom Publishing House. That was the name given by all the churches that we asked. It says, if you had a publishing house, what name would you like? And that was the name we landed on. In conclusion, I just want to say this. The Father sovereignly prepared these 3 strands beginning 70 years ago. With one man, then his family, his son, then a Cambodian man and his family. The Father has woven them together for the cord to be stronger to finish the task of equipping and discipling his church, his people, through the written page, so his work will endure in Cambodia. This is one example of the CMA of how God is finishing the work to the nations, to hear, to know the gospel, and then to follow him. Muncie Alliance Church, you are part of this work that is going on in Cambodia. As an Alliance Church, you are part of what God is doing in trying to finish the work in Cambodia. Please know that. By your involvement, by your giving, by your prayers, you are a part of what God is doing there in finishing the work. Please continue to pray and to give, and even consider, will somebody be sent from this place to finish the task? As Pastor said on Sunday, there are still 4,000 unreached, unengaged people groups in this world who do not know Jesus yet. And that is part of our responsibility. All right. I wanted to just give an opportunity for any kinds of questions that you might have. This is sort of a small group, an informal group. I wanted to give you that opportunity to ask anything that you heard that you didn't understand, or do you want to know more, or anything random even. Feel free to ask. Do my best to answer. Yes. Left one over there is Timothy, and he's been given many times of platform to the church, to the Association of Churches, to be able to give ministry. And so he's there talking about literature, but also talking about how they are a part of what God is doing in Cambodia. There we have, that's actually a place where we're selling books for Fount of Wisdom. It's actually part of a larger story. The Alliance Literature was the organization that I created when I first went into Cambodia, but it was primarily for Alliance churches. Well, about just a year ago, Fount of Wisdom took over responsibility of Alliance Literature and enveloped it into its business. And so now literature that is produced for CMA churches is also a part of this business and this ministry. And that is wonderful because it shows it's gone full circle and finally enveloped them as well. That was my goal a long time ago, and Timothy has been able to finalize that. We have over here in the right top is one of the workers at Fountain of Wisdom is actually using stories to tell stories to children, because one of the things that is lacking is the ability to encourage reading in Cambodia. And so what they tried to do is going to different villages and different places and reading to children, allowing them to hear stories, Bible stories, and then to encourage parents to come alongside and say, this is something good for your kids. And so it's just sort of an active way of getting them involved in reading, because there is still illiteracy in Cambodia as well. Over here on the bottom left, sort of embarrassing a little bit, I'm receiving a gift from Timothy because I came to visit on the 15th year anniversary of Fountain of Wisdom, and in good Cambodian fashion, any guests or anybody, and I was considered the founder, has to get a gift. So I'm getting a gift. There in the middle is a wonderful thing. We have been able to join in with a countrywide, a national booksellers group, if you will, that's secular, that's allowing us to sell Christian literature there. And so you get Christians and non-Christians, and in this case, monks are coming to look at our literature. And they actually are quite interested, not just by that picture, but Timothy tells me that there are a number of monks that he's had interaction with who say, can you tell me more? I want to know more because of what I read. And then lastly, just one of our newer staff members there, just showing a book that they're selling and promoting that. So just a number of activities and things that Fountain of Wisdom is involved in doing. Mm-hmm. Yes, Sarah. The best I know is that there was that explosion, and it probably went up to about 300,000 really quickly. But what was happening was that there was a lack of leadership for churches like that, and mature leadership. And the church, capital C, was not able to keep up with that. And so consequently, the numbers dwindled as a whole. I would say that the numbers are probably around the 200 to 220,000 right now, because there are constant new believers that come in. But there is also a growing discipleship that's going on of leadership. There's TE. I don't know if you've heard of TE, Theological Education by Extension. Actually, the CMA also nationalized that, so it wasn't just CMA. We then created an association of theological education and brought in all kinds of groups. So now it is spread throughout the country, happening to help leaders and to help even second or third tier leadership to grow in their faith. However, it's still difficult for the churches because churches are still poor. and supporting their pastor, supporting their leader is very difficult. And so the leader has to have a second job or have to work on the side, and therefore not able to give attention to ministry and to give all that they can there. And so it's very difficult for them. Consequently, I think even within the CMA, out of the 140 churches that I'm aware of, there's only 3 churches that have a full-time pastor. All of the rest are having to work or to figure out ways to support themselves. So that makes life difficult for them. Consequently, the church is steady, the church is growing, but it's still giving me some data. Okay. All right, this is for the CMA stats that I can give to you that Mary came up with. There are 65 organized churches throughout Cambodia, and that means that they are established, that they have a recognized pastor, but not necessarily fully supported, but they have leadership and a structure it's in place. They have 157 unorganized churches, meaning there's like a meeting place for worship. And there are 24 ordained ministers, which is good. That is up from when we left in 2010. We only had 3, so that's good news. And then there are 4,348 baptized members in that number. So that's the latest statistic for the CMA as a whole. I don't know the numbers of all of that for the larger church, how that is, but in general, the church continues to go forward. The churches continue to be recognized by the government as a significant body of people. It's recognized, it's accepted, and so that's good because you have a Buddhist country. For them to see the church as a significant group is huge. Does that help some? Okay. And I should mention here, within the CMA as well, we have churches among the following ethnic groups in Cambodia as well. There's actually 36 ethnic groups in Cambodia. And so here's the churches that are planted so far with the Khmer is one, the Vietnamese, the Jarai, the Bunong, the Kachok, the Kui, Dampuan, and there's a few others. So probably about 8 minority groups have churches that are being planted among them. Anything else? It seems like the kids are not out yet, so we've got a little bit of time still if you have any questions. Yes. Initially, we were not allowed to print. We weren't able to do that, and for a while the Cambodian Bible Society was not even able to come in and be organized. So it has taken some time for that to happen. But now the Bible Society is registered. They're able to sell Bibles, make them available in Cambodia. They even have managed somehow to get them imported because they're not printed in Cambodia. The quality is not good. They're too costly. So they print them in Korea, and then they're imported into Cambodia, and they can do that. The government has given them permission to do that. For Fountain of Wisdom, it is also a registered publishing house, and so all the activity that it does is known and allowed. Good question. I have a whole message about that, but I won't get into that for you. The way God's sovereign way of working through the refugees. But basically, I would say that um, the refugees that came back in probably um, out of the 350,000, I would say that at least a third to a half of them came back into the country. The remaining of those were repatriated to another country. They were able to get out and go somewhere else. So if you think about that, those who were Christ followers that came back in to Cambodia went to all the places that they were from and they were born. And the story is, sorry if I'm going to get a little bit off track here, but this is what I get excited about, is that these refugees were allowed to bring one bag back from the refugee camp into the country. For the Christ followers, we learned that the majority of them, instead of bringing their clothes with them, they brought bags full of literature to be able to share Christ in the places, the remote places that God sent them to. Those who were Christ followers then were sent to other countries as well, and were able to have impact in their communities for Christ. I will have to say that there are also stories of a large number of Christ followers who came to third world countries who stopped believing because they didn't have the support, they didn't have anyone there to walk with them, and so they just said, yeah, no, I don't believe anymore. So that's a sad part of the story as well. Good question. I'll try to speak about it without being too technical. Basically to say that the first translation was done in coordination with original languages, Bible languages, as well as English. And so the translation was not literal, and it was not word for word. It was on meaning. And so that was the desire of that missionary to do that. And I have materials, I have his books and things that he used for translation, so that's verified. I will say, though, that there is now one paraphrase and one other translation that is now available in Cambodian. One that is more of a, what's the term of, the simple English, more of a simple English, sort of a simple Khmer translation, more of your modern day English. I can't remember what the English. Pardon me? Right. And then there was one that was more literal and attempting to use more of the Old English as their translation. So those are the three varieties of scripture that are available. And I would say that the original one as well as the revision of the original one, I think really are still the very best translations as in the language ability that I had. My language was able to be good enough to check translations for the publishing house. So I thank the Lord that enabled me then to really examine the Bible as well, to see how good it was. Good question. Yes. In ministry? Mm-hmm. Um, what I know and remember from my mom, that she is actually the two main ministries that my mom was involved in was actually teaching at the Bible school. And she loved doing that mainly. I know that because that's one memory I have, is riding in the car with her. And in those days I sat in the front seat, nothing about security or safety there. So I remember doing that and going to there and playing with friends while she was teaching. The other ministry she had actually was checking translation of literature. And she was good enough in the language that she did some of that and even wrote some text for a sort of a picture Bible book that she was responsible for writing as well. So that was sort of the ministry she had while raising kids. And for Mary, you can speak for yourself better than I can, so why don't you do that? What kind of ministries have you been involved in?
How do you feel?
He's our oldest son, and so Eric and Sarah live here and are part of this church. Um, I'm sort of put in an awkward place speaking for Eric, so.
I can do this. I think that many missionary kids have one of two experiences. Either it was very beneficial, or there is some anger or frustration about having grown up overseas. I am the former. I think that I benefited greatly from having grown up overseas. I went to international schools. I had a variety of friends from many countries. I went to boarding school, and I think that was largely a positive experience as well. I think my parents did a very good job of valuing and putting effort into both the family life and their ministry, and so I think that was huge. So.
All right. I would say also that as they're all grown now, and 3 of our 4 are married, that they all speak of it with positive experiences. And while only one of them has had opportunities to live and work overseas since they came back here, that all of them are in people helping skills, people helping services. And so I think that has been a part of what has been a result of living overseas. How are you doing on time? Are the kids out yet? Okay. I don't want to go on forever and ever if you guys want to be done here, but give one more. Anyone has one last question? Here as in Muncie or as in? Yeah. I would say there are survivors. I would say those are thrivers, those who are doing well. I would say that there is a number of Cambodians who became pastors of churches. There are a number of Cambodians who went back to Cambodia to serve the Lord. There are many who didn't do so well and are struggling. So we have a combination of people like that, of the Cambodians that are here. Some who have done well in medicine, who have done well in politics, some who have done well just in jobs in general, some who did not do so well as parents and their children have a difficult life, but some who have done a great job. So they're all the way from the West Coast to the East Coast, and generally in the East Coast or West Coast or in Texas, a few stragglers in the Midwest, because they don't like the cold, so they want to get out as fast as possible. Good, good. All right. Well, we won't belabor it anymore, and if you have any other questions, feel free to come up and talk to us. But thank you all for coming tonight, and look forward to seeing you on Friday and Sunday, if you can make it. Thanks so much.